was sometime around midnight when I finally decided to take the next available exit. Not because I had planned to stop there, but because I had been driving north through the vast emptiness of Central California for several hours, and the persistent amber glow of the gas warning light on my dashboard had been staring back at me for far too long. The stretch of Highway 99 I was on felt especially desolate that night, surrounded by sprawling farmland, dark oil fields, and silhouettes of rusted irrigation machinery silhouetted faintly by moonlight. It all felt like a part of the state time had quietly forgotten. I hadn't passed another vehicle in what felt like half an hour, and with the nearest town spaced miles apart, the growing sense that I might find myself stranded along the roadside in the dead of night started to overtake the rational part of my mind that insisted I could make it to the next city. The moment I saw the weathered and barely legible road sign that suggested there was gas ahead, I took the off-ramp without hesitation towards a roadside, following a two-lane access road that curved gently past a small industrial area where several long-abandoned buildings stood in shadows like empty shells of something once functional. Just beyond those structures, tucked beside what may have once been a mechanic's garage, I saw the faint, flickering light of a gas station, its name either long since peeled away or buried under decades of dust, grime, and neglect. The station itself consisted of a single pump island with two rusting nozzles and a squat concrete storefront behind it, whose windows were obscured by layers of filth and aging decals that advertised cigarettes and soft drinks no longer in production. The only illumination came from a lone sodium vapor lamp above the pump, which buzzed softly as it pulsed its uneven light across the cracked pavement below. Despite the station's state of disrepair, the pump display was lit, its green digits blinking steadily as though nothing was out of the ordinary. And inside the small building, I could just barely make out the figure of a man standing behind the counter, frozen in place and almost blending into the stillness of everything around him. He appeared to be middle-aged or slightly older, wearing a pale blue uniform shirt with short sleeves and what looked like a stitched-on name patch, though I couldn't read it through the thick, dirt-streaked glass of the store's front windows. His arms rested flat on the counter, his posture stiff and oddly rigid, and he stared straight ahead with an expression that I couldn't immediately interpret, though something about it unsettled me even before I stepped out of my vehicle. After cutting the engine and stepping out into the warm, stagnant air, I grabbed the gas nozzle and began refueling. As I stood beside the pump, I glanced toward the window again, only to find that the man hadn't moved even slightly, his eyes still locked in that strange, unfocused stare, as though he were waiting for something or someone just outside my field of vision. The silence around the station was absolute, interrupted only by the occasional buzz of the overhead light or the distant hum of some unseen engine miles away. I thought briefly that perhaps he hadn't noticed me or was half asleep on his feet, but even that didn't explain the unnatural stillness that hung around him like an atmosphere all its own. Once the tank was full, I retrieved a crumpled $10 bill from my wallet, stepped onto the faded walkway leading to the front entrance, and pushed the door open, which resisted slightly, as though the hinges had not been used in days. A chime above the door rang out, not clearly, but in a muted, broken sort of way. And I stepped inside to find myself enveloped by an interior that was noticeably colder than the air outside, which struck me immediately given how the night had retained so much of the day's heat. The coolness felt unnatural, as if the building itself were insulated from the outside world in some inexplicable way. And as I moved further into the space, I noticed that the usual background noises I had come to expect in such places, refrigerator hums, buzzing lights, the faint crackle of an old radio, were all absent. The man behind the counter remained in that same unchanging posture, his hands still resting palms down on the laminate surface, his shoulders squared and unmoving, and his eyes continuing to gaze forward, not at me directly, but toward a fixed point just above and beyond the doorway I had entered through, as though something behind me held his unwavering attention. His skin looked sallow under the dim ceiling lights, and although I was standing only a few feet away from him now, I couldn't detect the usual subtle movements that accompany a living person. No shifting of weight, no subtle breaths expanding his chest, no eye movements following mine. He remained entirely still, like a photograph caught between frames. And it struck me then, with a cold certainty, that I had not once seen him blink. I placed the $10 bill down on the counter, hesitating for a moment to see if he would react. I wanted him to acknowledge the money, to nod or make some sound to confirm that I had done the right thing, but he made no move at all. Instead, he continued staring past me as though he were operating on a script I wasn't part of. Wanting to end the interaction quickly, I picked up a bottled water from a nearby shelf and placed it next to the bill. Half out of habit, and half to justify my presence in a space that had started to feel increasingly wrong. When he didn't respond, not even with a flicker of his eyelids or a shift in his jaw, I backed away slowly, not speaking, and exited the building with the same quiet dread with which I had entered. The moment the door closed behind me, the warm air rushed back against my face, and I walked briskly to the car without looking back toward the windows, feeling a sharp, irrational urgency to put distance between myself and whatever it was I had just experienced. I turned onto the road and rejoined the highway, expecting the strangeness to fade with every passing mile. But instead, the unease that had first whispered at the back of my mind now took hold more firmly, tightening with every mile marker I passed. As I drove, my mind replayed the scene inside the store in relentless detail, focusing on the unnatural way the man had stood, how completely he had failed to react, and how, despite all my efforts, I could not remember even a single moment in which he had moved. The deeper I considered it, the clearer it became that what I had witnessed was not mere fatigue or inattentiveness on his part. It had been something else entirely, something fundamentally wrong in a way I could not explain. 10 minutes later, unable to shake the growing anxiety in my chest, I pulled onto the shoulder of the highway and sat there for a long moment, gripping my phone tightly in my hand while I stared out into the night. Eventually, I called the sheriff's department and explained, as best I could, that I had stopped at a gas station outside Bakersfield and encountered something I couldn't quite put into words. A man who seemed off, unresponsive, frozen in place, and who hadn't reacted to my presence at all. I requested a welfare check, not even sure what that really meant in such a case, but needing someone else to verify what I had seen, or at least to tell me I was imagining it. The next morning, I received a phone call from a Kern County deputy who asked me to confirm the location where I'd stopped and to describe in detail the man I had seen. I did so as clearly as I could. His approximate age, his uniform, his position behind the counter. And after a brief silence, the deputy informed me, in a slow and deliberate tone, that the man I had interacted with had been found deceased inside the store. He had been murdered, They had discovered his body collapsed on the floor behind the counter, concealed from view. And the coroner's report determined that he had been stabbed multiple times in the back, with no defensive wounds present, indicating he had likely been taken by surprise and killed swiftly sometime before 11:40 p.m. that night. I had arrived well after that time. The footage retrieved from the station's security cameras confirmed this timeline. The last time the real attendant was seen alive was at precisely 11:38 p.m., captured assisting a customer and returning to his position behind the counter. At that moment, the video suffered a brief but noticeable glitch, just under 2 seconds of digital distortion. And when the image returned, the man appeared to be standing in the same spot, facing forward, hands positioned exactly as before. But something was different. From that point forward, for nearly 4 hours, the figure behind the counter remained completely motionless, never blinking, never shifting, never interacting with anything or anyone. His stillness was confirmed from multiple camera angles, and at approximately 12:07 a.m., a woman entered the store, placed a $10 bill and a bottle of water on the counter, and left. That woman, of course, was me. I had seen and approached the person or presence, posing as the attendant. I had spoken into that void, expecting something human to respond, and nothing had. At 3:42 a.m., the footage glitched again, and when it cleared, the space behind the counter was empty. No exit was captured on film. No trace of the impersonator remained. There were no fingerprints at the scene besides the victim's and my own. The cash register had not been disturbed. No murder weapon was recovered. The impersonator was never identified. And the station, having already operated on the verge of closure, was permanently shut down and sealed off by the end of the week. I've tried in the years since to understand what I saw that night, to piece together how someone, if it was a person, could remain so perfectly still, so convincingly lifeless, and then vanish without leaving behind the slightest trace. But the more I replay the moment, the more I return to the single, most unnerving detail of all. If the man I saw behind that counter was already dead, then who or what had been standing in his place? I spent several years working the overnight shift at a gas station just outside Amarillo, Texas. A quiet, almost forgotten stretch of highway where the landscape turns into little more than empty fields and long, dark roads, especially after midnight when the daytime traffic thins out and the desert cold settles in. It wasn't the kind of job most people wanted, but back then, I liked the solitude. Nights where the only sound inside the store came from the soft, mechanical hum of the refrigerators and the flickering buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. A dull background noise that kept you company when no one else was around. Most nights passed without anything unusual happening. The hours blending into each other as I cleaned coffee stations, restocked shelves, and watched the empty highway stretch silently across the security monitors. After a while, you learn to live with the stillness. You learn to stop looking at the clock. And you get used to the strange thoughts that come when you're the only person awake for miles. But there was one night, early in 2016, that never blurred into the routine. A night that still replays in my mind with a clarity that makes it impossible to forget, no matter how much time passes. It was late February, one of those nights where the sky looks darker than usual, and the cold wind rattles the metal siding of the station in a way that almost sounds like footsteps if you're tired enough. The digital clock on the register had just clicked over to 2:30 a.m. when I noticed the silver sedan pull into the lot, coming in much faster than anyone usually would at that hour, the tires skidding slightly as they caught the edge of the curb near pump 3 before the driver slammed the brakes and brought the car to a stop in a jerky, uneven motion that immediately caught my attention. From the counter inside the store, where I stood wiping down the scratched plastic surface with an old rag, I watched as the driver climbed out of the car, and it was obvious from the first glance that something wasn't right. He looked to be in his mid-30s, with unshaven stubble along his jawline, messy hair that stuck up as though he'd been running his hands through it repeatedly, and deep, shadowed circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept properly in days, maybe even longer. His posture was tight, his shoulders hunched in a way that made it seem like he was bracing for something, and his head kept twitching as he glanced repeatedly into the rearview mirror, not just once or twice like someone might do out of habit, but over and over again, as if he were terrified of what he might see there. When he stepped inside the store, the cold air clung to his clothes, and his hands trembled slightly as he reached for his wallet, his fingers fumbling with the bills as he counted out cash for gas in a way that made it clear he wasn't fully focused on the task at hand, like his mind was stuck somewhere else, on something behind him, maybe, or something he couldn't explain. There was no conversation, no small talk, no awkward attempt at a joke like some travelers made when passing through in the middle of the night. Just a hollow, distant look in his eyes that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up without me fully understanding why at the time. After he handed over the money, he stood at the counter for a few seconds longer than he needed to, his gaze drifting toward the security camera monitor behind me, his lips pressed together like he was wrestling with something he wasn't sure he should say. Eventually, without meeting my eyes directly, he leaned in slightly, close enough that I could smell the cold sweat and the stale air trapped in his jacket. And though his voice was low, barely above a whisper, it carried a kind of shaky desperation that I still remember clearly, even after all these years. Without asking for permission or waiting for a reaction, he told me that something was wrong with his car. That as far as he knew, he had been driving alone all night. But somewhere between Amarillo and my station, he had looked into his mirror and seen a figure sitting in the back seat, slumped forward in a way that didn't make sense, unmoving, as though they had been there the entire time without him realizing it. His eyes locked onto mine just long enough for me to see the fear swimming behind them. And then, just as suddenly, he broke the eye contact, turned away, and walked back out into the cold night air without saying another word, leaving me standing there, unsure of whether I'd just witnessed the kind of panic that comes from sleep deprivation or something far stranger. After he left, I finished cleaning the coffee station, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled in my chest, telling myself that people see strange things on long drives all the time, especially when it's late, and their minds start playing tricks on them. But around 5 in the morning, when the sky began to lighten and the first hints of sunrise appeared beyond the gas station lights, the next shift arrived. And I remembered what the man had said about the back seat, about the figure he thought he saw. And despite my better judgment, I decided to check the security footage from Pump 3 just to satisfy my own curiosity and put the thought to rest. I sat in the small back office, the stale smell of old coffee lingering in the air, and pulled up the footage from the night's shift, fast-forwarding through the dead hours until the silver sedan appeared on the screen, headlights cutting across the concrete lot as it came into view. The image was clear, sharper than I expected given the age of our cameras. And at first, everything looked normal. Just a man pulling into the gas station. Tired, probably anxious. Nothing unusual about that. But when I looked closer, focusing on the rear passenger window of the car as it slowed down beside pump 3, I felt my stomach tighten in a way that made it hard to breathe. There was someone in the back seat. It wasn't a shadow or a reflection from the gas station lights. This was unmistakably a human figure, slumped forward in the rear passenger seat, pale and still, head bowed low as if they were asleep or unconscious, their arms resting limply at their sides, almost blending into the darkness except for the unnatural, almost grayish tone of their exposed skin. I stared at the screen, frozen in place, watching frame by frame as the car came to a stop, the driver stepping out and closing the door behind him, while the figure in the back seat remained perfectly still, unmoving, as though they were part of the car itself. But as I continued to watch, something happened that made the air in the room feel colder, as if someone had opened a door to the outside without me noticing. The figure in the back seat didn't get out of the car or shift position in any normal way. Instead, they started to fade, slowly at first, just a soft blurring around the edges of their form, and then more rapidly, frame by frame, until their shape dissolved completely, leaving the back seat empty by the time the driver finished pumping his gas and got back behind the wheel. I must have watched the footage a dozen times that morning, rewinding and playing it again, leaning in closer to the grainy monitor, trying to catch some logical explanation for what I was seeing. But no matter how many times I went over it, the sequence never changed. The car arrived, headlights bright in the camera. The driver stepped out looking pale and nervous, and for those first few frames, there was always the figure in the back seat, hunched over like they were folded into themselves, before they slowly, almost deliberately, vanished from sight. I saved the footage onto a flash drive before my shift ended, locking it away in a drawer at home where it stayed, untouched, for weeks afterward. I didn't tell my manager or the other clerks about it because part of me wasn't sure how to explain what I had seen without sounding like I'd lost my mind. And another part of me didn't want to risk drawing more attention to it. Like talking about it too openly might somehow make it worse. 2 nights later, just after midnight, the same silver sedan came back to the station. And this time, the driver didn't get out right away. He sat in the car for a long time with the engine running, his headlights off, staring silently through the windshield toward the storefront, like he was weighing whether or not to come inside. Eventually, he stepped out, walking slowly toward the door with his head down, his shoulders even more hunched than before. And when he finally entered the store, I noticed the raw red marks on his knuckles and the way his hands shook slightly as he wiped them nervously on his jeans. He didn't buy anything during that visit, didn't make small talk or even look around the store. Instead, he stood near the counter for a moment, his face pale and drawn, his eyes darting toward the windows like he still half expected to see someone out there waiting for him in the darkness. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and hollow, as if he had rehearsed what he was going to say many times before building up the courage to say it aloud. He told me that ever since the last time he had stopped at the station, he'd been hearing the sound of soft breathing behind him while driving. Quiet, shallow breaths that always seemed to come from the back seat, no matter how many times he checked and found nothing there. He said that he had pulled over twice on the highway, once near the outskirts of town and once further west, just to be sure he wasn't imagining it. But the second time he reached back to touch the seat, his hand came away wet. According to him, The back seat of his car was completely soaked through, as if someone had been sitting there, drenched from head to toe. And the smell that rose up from the fabric was like stagnant pond water. Thick, sour, and cold. The kind of smell that sinks into your clothes and stays with you long after you've tried to wash it away. The windows had been rolled up the entire time. The trunk was dry, and there hadn't been any rain that night, leaving no explanation for why the upholstery felt like it had been submerged in something. After that, he said, he started driving with the back seat permanently folded down so that he could see straight through to the trunk, keeping the car empty and open in a way that gave him at least the illusion of control. He stopped picking up friends, stopped offering rides to anyone, and even considered selling the car. But the thought of passing whatever was attached to it onto someone else felt worse than keeping it for himself. I never saw the man again after that second visit. He didn't come back to the station, and I don't know if he moved away, traded the car, or simply stopped driving at night altogether. But for months afterward, I kept thinking about the footage, the way the figure in the back seat had faded, not like a camera glitch or a reflection, but like something that knew it was being watched and chose to disappear anyway. The flash drive with the footage is still in my house, buried in a drawer that I haven't opened in a long time. People have asked me why I never uploaded it, why I've never shared it publicly or tried to get attention from it. But the truth is, no matter how many times I watch it, the outcome is always the same. And somehow, that makes it worse. A car pulls into the lot, headlights slicing across the pavement. The driver steps out, eyes wide and frightened, checking the mirror over and over again. And in the back seat, just for a few frames, there is always someone sitting behind him who wasn't supposed to be there. Even now, years later, there are nights when I find myself driving home from late shifts or running errands after dark. And without thinking, my eyes drift to the rearview mirror. Not because I believe I'll see anything back there, but because I know I can't stop myself from looking. And when I do, there's always a part of me that braces for it, wondering if this will be the night I see it again. Wondering if whatever was in that car is still out there, waiting for someone else to pick it up. Back in the spring of 2001, I was working the overnight shift at a small, independently owned 24-hour gas station just outside the outskirts of Fresno, tucked near an old frontage road where the city's lights faded into long stretches of dark farmland and the occasional glow of passing semis. It was the kind of place most people barely noticed unless they needed fuel in the middle of the night or directions, or maybe just a moment to pull over and breathe during a long drive that had gone on too long. The building itself was narrow and aging, with buzzing fluorescent lights that flickered more than they illuminated. And the concrete lot outside had faded lane paint and long hairline cracks that spiderwebbed from years of sun and wear. I was 24 years old, just barely scraping by, and taking whatever work I could find after cycling through a series of temp jobs that never seemed to last more than a season. The job itself wasn't complicated. It mostly involved sitting behind the glass counter for long, uneventful hours, restocking shelves between brief waves of customers, and occasionally stepping outside to wipe down pump handles or chase off the odd drifter who lingered too long under the canopy. For the first few months, the work was so routine, it blurred into a haze of late-night static on the radio. Stale coffee and the familiar hum of refrigeration units that filled the quiet with their mechanical breathing. I didn't mind the stillness. In fact, I preferred it. The silence was a kind of comfort, and it made the hours pass without friction. But during the first week of April that year, something unusual happened that disrupted the quiet pattern I had grown used to, and eventually fractured my sense of what was explainable. It started one night just after 3 in the morning, when the old payphone outside the store, which stood mounted in a narrow, glass-paneled booth a few steps from the entrance, began to ring. At first, I didn't pay it much attention. I had assumed it was either some customer trying to reach someone nearby, or maybe a prank. Kids from one of the neighborhoods not far off, dialing in just to pass the time. Still, I answered the store phone out of habit, thinking someone might be trying to reach me indirectly. But when I picked up the line, there was no voice, no ambient noise, and no indication that anyone was on the other end. Only a heavy, empty silence that somehow felt deliberate, as if someone was there but refusing to speak. I paused, expecting something, perhaps a laugh, a cough, or even just the rustling of fabric, but nothing came through. After several seconds, I quietly returned the handset to its cradle and let the moment pass without further thought. It wasn't until the following night that the timing began to feel like more than coincidence. On the second night, as the hour crept past 3 once again, the phone began to ring at precisely 3:13 a.m. And this time, I made sure to glance at the wall clock to mark the time, already half curious if it would repeat. The booth outside remained empty, just as it had the night before. But the sound of the phone, shrill, insistent, and slightly distorted from age, echoed against the glass panes and concrete lot in a way that felt invasive in the otherwise still air. Once more, when I picked up the receiver, I was met with complete and unnatural silence. No sound, no signal crackle, not even the faint background noise of an active connection. It felt less like a failed call and more like someone was deliberately holding the line open, creating an absence that was, somehow, louder than sound itself. By the time the third night arrived, the pattern had lodged itself in the back of my mind with a discomfort I couldn't quite shake. And as I went about the usual closing procedures and nightly cleaning, I found myself pausing more often than usual to glance out at the phone booth. When the clock struck 3:13 again, and the phone began to ring for a third consecutive night, I remained still behind the counter, watching from behind the safety of the store's wide glass window, unwilling to answer but unable to look away. The phone rang exactly 12 times, then fell silent as abruptly as it had begun, leaving behind a quiet that felt deeper and more unnatural than any I'd experienced before. When I went home that morning, sleep came only in shallow fits, and though I tried to dismiss the experience with logic, telling myself it could easily have been a technical fault or someone prank calling from elsewhere, I couldn't ignore the growing sense that the timing was too precise to be random. On the fourth night, despite my better judgment, I made the decision not to wait behind the counter. I told myself I wouldn't answer, but that I'd see for myself whether the phone booth was truly as empty as it always appeared. When the ringing began, at the same minute once again, I stepped out from behind the glass doors and into the still, chilled air of the early morning. Feeling the concrete cold beneath my shoes and the soft whistle of wind passing through the lot, the booth stood as it always had, quiet and vacant except for the sound of the receiver bouncing gently off the side of the panel, as though someone had recently dropped it and left in haste. I took a few cautious steps toward it, but as I neared, something in the corner of my eye pulled my attention away, and I turned to look across the lot toward the gas pumps. Standing next to pump hash 4 was a woman, alone and completely motionless, her bare feet planted on the cracked concrete, her thin, hospital-style gown fluttering faintly in the wind. Her posture was unsettling in its stillness, her arms hanging at her sides, and her long dark hair draped across her face in uncombed tangles that caught the light in dull, uneven patches. She did not appear startled or in distress, nor did she make any effort to signal or speak, but simply stared in my direction with a kind of vacant intensity that made the air around her feel colder than the night warranted. Though I was instinctively unsettled, I took a tentative step forward, unsure of whether she was lost, confused, or in need of help. But just as I began to cross the lot, she shifted, turned, and without any hesitation, stepped behind the pump, vanishing from view. When I reached the other side of the pump, just seconds later, I found nothing. The lot was completely empty. There were no footsteps leading away, no sound of retreating footsteps, no movement behind the nearby dumpsters or at the edge of the lot. It was as if the woman had dissolved into the ground beneath her, or had been part of the air itself, a thing that had never belonged to the physical world in the first place. I returned to the store in a state of quiet shock and called the police, explaining what I had seen and asking them to come check the property. When the officers arrived, I walked them through what had happened and pointed out the pump, trying to describe the woman without sounding like I had lost touch with reality. They listened politely, offering the kind of blank expressions that betrayed their disbelief. But they conducted their search regardless, combing through the small lot and peeking behind each pump and trash bin. It was one of the officers who discovered the narrow utility panel at the base of pump hash 4, which had been left slightly ajar and seemed to have been tampered with. When he pulled it open, he found a folded, scorched document tucked inside, its corners browned and brittle from what looked like exposure to flame. The paper was a death certificate. The name printed on it was Angela DeLay, a woman aged 36, whose cause of death was listed as suicide, and whose time of death was recorded as precisely 3:13 a.m. She had died exactly 1 year earlier, in a psychiatric hospital located less than 2 miles from the gas station where I'd seen her. I watched the officers exchange a glance, then fold the paper without a word, and tell me someone from the department would be in touch, though no follow-up call ever came. And I never heard the name mentioned again. Over the following weeks, the payphone continued to ring at the same time each night, and though I never again dared to answer, I heard from a handful of customers that they too had heard it ringing, sulking during late hours, often accompanied by an overwhelming sense of dread. One man, who stopped for cigarettes around 3:30 one morning, told me that he had picked up the phone out of curiosity and for just a moment thought he heard a woman crying quietly before the line went dead. The phone was removed entirely a month later, officially due to outdated infrastructure and lack of use. But I suspected the decision had been made for other reasons no one wanted to acknowledge out loud. I left the job not long after and took work further north, distancing myself from the experience as best I could. But even now, years later, I still find myself waking in the middle of the night for no reason at all, glancing at the clock with a tightening in my chest. Whenever I see the numbers 3:13 glowing softly in the dark, I feel the weight of something I still can't explain, a presence that never fully left. And I wonder, often against my will, what would have happened if I had answered that phone just one more time, and whether whatever waited on the other end might finally have spoken. It was the summer after high school graduation, a time that should have been saturated with nothing more than cheap thrills, blurry photos, and the soft panic of growing up. And yet all of that was eclipsed by what happened that afternoon, just outside Flagstaff, Arizona. A moment that divided my life sharply into two parts: the time before she disappeared and the time after. There were 5 of us on that trip, crammed into an SUV that smelled like sunscreen, spilled soda, and something vaguely melted in the back seat that we never identified. Just kids chasing something intangible along Route 66, telling ourselves it was freedom when really it was just a stretch of road and the illusion that nothing truly bad could ever happen to us. Marissa was with us. She had always been the one who insisted on documenting everything, who carried a disposable camera because she thought grainy film made moments feel more honest, more permanent somehow. Like if she captured it right, the memory couldn't vanish. We'd stopped for gas at a rundown service station a few miles west of town, the kind of place you only see because you're already running on fumes, and the next stop is too far to risk it. A building with faded paint, sun-warped signs, and a single lonely fuel pump that beeped loudly every time someone so much as glanced at it. The sky was wide and bleached, and the heat shimmered off the asphalt in lazy waves, the kind that make the distance look like it's melting into itself. There was a diner attached to the station, the kind with no customers and no visible staff. And beside that, tucked behind the main building, was a single unisex restroom. No different from 1,000 others we'd seen that week. Simple, unremarkable, and functional. Marissa said she needed to use the bathroom and stepped out of the car without waiting for a response. Her phone in her hand, but her purse left behind, claiming she'd only be a minute and disappearing around the corner with the same easy confidence she carried into every room. She was wearing denim shorts and a faded tank top with the remains of some logo on it. Her shoes worn thin from months of overuse. Her dark hair twisted lazily into a knot at the back of her head in the way she always did when it was too hot to care. The rest of us stayed in the car, too tired to follow, and too relaxed to notice how long she was gone at first. The engine humming, the air conditioning fighting a losing battle against the desert heat, and the faint crackle of music from someone's phone filling the silence in place of conversation. At first, I didn't even glance at the time, assuming she was inside grabbing a bottle of water or scrolling through messages while waiting her turn. But after several minutes passed, and she still hadn't returned, I reached for my phone and sent her a quick message. Something teasing, nothing serious. Just enough to prompt her to hurry up. When she didn't reply, I sent another. And when that too went unanswered, I tried calling, only to hear it go straight to voicemail. A small detail that struck me as strange, but not yet alarming. I turned to the others, asked if anyone had seen her come out, and when everyone shook their heads, we decided to walk over and check, assuming maybe she'd gotten sick or locked herself in or was simply waiting longer than expected because someone else was inside. The bathroom door was closed when we reached it, and when we tried the handle, it didn't move. It was locked from the inside. We knocked gently at first, then louder, calling her name through the metal, listening for any sound from within. But there was no response. No footsteps, no movement, no answer. The hallway behind the gas station was still and unshaded, the air dry and stagnant. And every second that passed in silence began to shift something in our stomachs, something that started to feel a lot like dread. We ran back into the store and asked the station manager if he could unlock the door. And although he looked uncertain, possibly assuming we were overreacting or caught up in some adolescent drama, something in our voices must have registered as genuine, because after a brief hesitation, he reached under the counter for a heavy ring of keys and followed us out behind the building, his expression growing more serious with each step. When he turned the key in the lock, the bolt clicked, and the door creaked open with a metallic groan. But the room beyond it was completely empty. There was no sign of Marissa. The bathroom was small, barely large enough for a single person to stand comfortably between the chipped porcelain sink and the rust-stained toilet. There was no open window, no ventilation grate wide enough for even a child to slip through. And the ceiling was sealed with flat, discolored tiles that had clearly not been disturbed in years. The air inside the stall felt heavy, like it had been occupied only moments before. And the light overhead buzzed quietly in the kind of rhythmic flicker that draws attention to silence. Her phone was sitting on the edge of the sink, face down, and cracked across one corner as if it had been dropped from a height or yanked abruptly from her hand, and the mirror above it bore a single long smear that looked like a handprint dragged downward across the glass. There was nothing else. No torn clothing, no shoe, no sound of running water or the echo of a flushed toilet. Just a strange and absolute absence that made no logical sense. We stood there in stunned confusion, each of us frozen in place and struggling to reconcile what we were seeing with what we knew had to be true, which was that she had gone into that room and, by all appearances, had never come back out. The store manager looked as bewildered as we did, standing just inside the doorway as though unsure whether he was witnessing a prank or something far more serious. And I remember the way the light reflected off the cracked screen of her phone, how it made the spiderweb fracture look deeper, darker. The police arrived not long after we called, and the bathroom was sealed off while they began questioning everyone. Us, the station staff, even a trucker who'd been parked out near the edge of the lot the entire time. They combed the entire property, from the gas station interior to the brush surrounding the lot, including dumpsters, storage closets, and even the roof. But nothing turned up. Surveillance footage from outside the building showed Marissa walking past the pumps and around the back corner toward the restroom, her silhouette clear in the sun-bleached footage. And then, nothing. No one else was seen entering after her. No figure emerged from the restroom. No shadow crossed back through the camera's narrow field of view. It was as if the building had swallowed her. In the days that followed, the search widened. Her family arrived. Flyers were posted along highways and inside stores. Volunteers walked the desert in the punishing sun. And for a brief window of time, the whole region was paying attention. Then, 3 days later, a long-haul trucker traveling northbound reported something he believed was connected. He told authorities that he had seen a young woman walking barefoot near a rest stop outside Camp Verde, roughly 70 miles from where Marissa had disappeared, and that she looked disoriented, possibly injured, her clothes dirty and torn in places, her steps uneven, like someone who had been wandering for hours without direction. He said she passed close to his rig and seemed to be speaking softly to herself. Though he could only make out fragments of what she was saying, words like mirror and something that sounded like, "Don't look back." Before he could approach her, she disappeared behind a maintenance building. And when he parked and followed, she was gone. A full search of the area was conducted, but again, nothing was found. No footprints, no discarded clothing, no sign of forced entry into nearby buildings, and the security footage at the rest stop failed to capture any image of the girl he described. Although he later identified Marissa from a photo shown to him by investigators, and although his description matched what she had been wearing on the day she vanished, there was no physical evidence to confirm the sighting. And without it, the case remained open, but stagnant. The gas station where she disappeared was sold the following year, and the new owners remodeled the interior, replacing the fixtures, repainting the walls, and installing a new mirror in the restroom. Despite the changes, stories continued to circulate. Accounts from travelers who claimed the bathroom still felt strange, that the lock would jam without warning, or that they would catch a glimpse of something in the reflection that vanished before they could turn around. These stories were never taken seriously by the authorities, of course, and yet I've read enough of them to know that I'm not the only one who remembers how the room felt that day. I still have a photograph taken the morning before she vanished, a blurred shot from the disposable camera Marissa had insisted we use, and in the background, partially obscured, she's holding a drink and laughing, her mouth open mid-sentence, her eyes squinting in the sun. It's not a good photo by any technical standard, but I keep it because it's the last time she existed in any moment I can prove. What unsettles me most, after all these years, is not just that she vanished, but that there was no sound, no struggle, no warning. Just a locked door and the inexplicable silence that followed. And though I have stood in countless restrooms since that day, I've never once looked into a public mirror without a flicker of unease, without the feeling that something might be watching just beyond the reflection, something that doesn't belong on this side of the glass.